Dr. Frobose serves as the Commercial Director of North America for Giga Technologies, a Quebec-based company producing Gestalt brand precision feeding systems for the swine industry. Hyatt specializes in assisting swine producers with group housing solutions and nutritional programs to optimize performance and welfare of sows and growing pigs in commercial environments. Dr. Frobose has been a featured speaker and specialist working with producers around the world in adopting new technologies and adapting to increased animal welfare standards. In 2023, Hyatt was awarded the Early Career in Agribusiness Award by the American Society of Animal Science in his role with Giga. Hyatt has assisted with the design and renovation of over 300 sow farms representing over 500,000 sows. Dr. Frobose and his family are based in Greeley, Kansas, and are actively involved in their church, local 4-H programs, and seed-stock Gelby cow-calf operations. So if you would, help me welcome to the stage Dr. Hyatt Frobose.
Good afternoon. I need to shorten my bio up. Sorry about that. I need to have a condensed version. I know we got a lot of good people here speaking today, and appreciate you guys taking the time to listen to some of the things that we put together. This is actually some research that we presented at the Gestalt Swine Summit we had in Quebec at our headquarters last fall, and was asked to re-give some of that to you guys in the audience. I know a lot of you guys were not necessarily present at that event, but at the end of the day, I appreciated Omar kind of setting things up for me pretty well, as he kind of said, the maternal nutrition side is an area where we've got a lot of opportunity. Well, per the bio, you can see that I spend a lot of time on the sow side. So I get to wake up each day working with producers who are giving us a lot of feedback and a lot of data about what their sows are doing on their farms as we're working with precision feeding systems. And one of the things that was kind of the genesis of doing this research in the first place and kind of challenging this mindset is we've been doing several nutritional studies over the years, and one of the things we kept seeing from time to time was more sows than we expected gaining weight or gaining back fat during lactation. And that really kind of got my gears turning, because many of you guys are students and stuff. I don't think they teach you that in school, right? They teach you that sows are going to mobilize their own body tissue and give it to the litter, and she's probably going to come out of lactation thinner and lighter than she went in. Well, we kept seeing a certain number of sows that didn't do that. And so we wanted to challenge that. And what it really comes down to is there some differences in efficiency in these sows that might be leading to some of those different observations? And so first of all, we had to figure out what lactational feed efficiency really needs to be defined as. That was one of the first challenges that I had to work with PIC alongside in this data set, is we really needed to create some definitions of lactational feed efficiency to hopefully encapsulate some of those differences in the modern sow. So this roadmap of what we're going to cover today, just kind of outlined here, we need to also explain why lactational feed efficiency in our definition has been historically pretty hard to measure, and what we need to capture in order to be able to explain that more fully. And some of the older methods of lactational feed efficiency may have masked some of the inefficiencies that we actually see. One thing that we're going to talk about is actually categorizing sows in a commercial population into different categories of lactational feed efficiency. And I think that's maybe one of the best ways to illustrate the variation that we have in the sow farms today. And coming back to that, there are no average sows. I think that's one of the big takeaways you're going to find, is the amount of variation we have in intake and efficiency in the average sow farm is pretty stark. And then we'll just summarize those key findings and kind of next steps about how we measure that, define that, and go forward with lactational feed efficiency. So, quick backdrop. Most of you know that the goal in our lactating sows is generally to maximize feed intake so that we can optimize milk production and minimize how much body tissue she mobilizes prior to weaning, right? Historically, we've all been trained, we got to have feed in front of her all the time in lactation so that she can eat as much as she wants, right? However, those requirements, and those of you that are nutritionists in the room are basing your diet formulations off of the requirements the best you know, they're going to vary based on how big those sows are, what they're made of coming in, how much fat, how much lean they have coming in, what we expect their milk yield and composition to be based on litter size and litter growth expectations. And we all can recognize, and most of you that spend some time in sow farms know, that these sows have really just hit another gear. And kudos to all of our genetics companies in the past few years, because I think it's really obvious what these girls are capable of in 2026. But oftentimes I use the analogy of we've got a female that's a race car, and I don't know that we always get the right fuel in her. And that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about here, about what we need to be migrating towards with the hyper-prolific female that we have today. So again, partnered with PIC on a lot of this data collection and analysis, and appreciate some of their data that they shared here for the presentation today. As we stated, sows today are more productive and produce larger litters than ever before. And if you look at the genetic trend on the left, you can see that over the past 15 years, at least within the PIC females, we see not only an increase in total born, but especially after there was a selection pressure placed on birth weight, we can see that we've gotten that birth weight linear increase right there alongside the increases in total born. So this fits that sow nursing larger litters thought process. Along with that, we've successfully selected for better pre-weaning survival. So we're keeping those girls, those pigs on the sow alive all the way through weaning, but this is putting more demands on those sows, of course. Again, these lactating sows are growing faster than their predecessors as well, and that's part of this piece, right? So if we look at the genetic trend for growth in maternal lines, at least within the PIC population, you can see in red the maternal line's genetic growth year over year in grams per day. If you line that up along the blue, which is terminal boar lines, you can see that those maternal females are growing at an increasing rate just as fast as their terminal counterparts. I think that might surprise some of you, but basically we've got gilts that are growing faster than ever before, and those of you that spend any time in GDUs today will understand that. We've got some pigs that get really big really fast, right? Because of that, we've run into some problems with too many gilts getting bred above the current recommendations for weight at breeding. So historically, PIC's target has been breeding those girls between 144 and 159 kilos. You can see those two spectrums there. And when we look at today's gilts versus the gilts of 10 years ago, at least within PIC's own data set, they're seeing 4 times as many gilts getting bred above the target upper threshold of breeding weight. And so what happens when we breed girls heavier is they stay heavier for the rest of their life. So we end up with bigger sows than we initially desire. But is that what we're formulating our diets to? Is that matching their intake and their requirements? I think that's part of the question here is, do we need to be doing a better job getting these gilts bred at the right weight? Because these heavier gilts become heavier sows. You can see here on the left an example of gilt body weight at breeding of 144 kilos. And you can see the yellow line is basically a diet formulated at 5.9 megacals per day. You can see that for most of these girls throughout their life, if they're eating that much energy, they're able to maintain or gain weight with that type of gestation feeding regimen. But if the gilt was bred heavier, 15 kilos heavier in this example, you can see that that yellow line and the rate of gain for each of these parities changes, right? So that bigger gilt is now bigger forever, and her diet, if it doesn't change, is going to be inadequate, especially later on in life. So the end result of these girls getting bred too heavy is that throughout their life, their maintenance requirements increase, at least in this population, to the tune of about 250 grams per sow per day. That's a lot of feed if you take that over her entire lifetime of the cost of breeding that gilt too heavy. Now, how does that relate to lactation, you might be wondering? Well, we're coming to that here. But if you look at here, this is some recent data done by Ron Navalis and others, and it really shows that in sows, if they are losing weight, if they are gaining weight in gestation, they are more likely to come into lactation and milk better and raise a larger litter. But conversely, for sows that are losing weight in gestation, maybe use late gestation as an example, maybe because the diets haven't been formulated to the weight of those sows, if they are losing weight in late gestation, they actually compensate for that during lactation. And I think that's something that's a little contrary to what we would always expect, right? We'd expect that sow to prioritize the litter. Well, if she comes in deficient in some regard or in a negative body state, she's more likely to actually regain her own body tissue rather than prioritizing the litter. And I think that fits into these lactation efficiency categories that we talk about later. And one of the things that we didn't have in our data set was prior knowledge of what her change in body catabolism or anabolism was in gestation. But alongside this, these sows today, over the course of the last 15 years, you can see that they've been selected to be leaner, that's in red, and have greater loin depth. So these gilts have less body fat and more body lean as a proportion than they previously did. So these girls are coming into farrowing with less fat as a percentage of their tissue. So if they have to mobilize that tissue quicker, you can see that they're probably going to have to start tucking into protein as well if they don't have enough body fat to mobilize. So with that, you can see here that when we overlay this with intake, on the left you've got a group of gilts, and on the right you've got a group of sows. You can see that if their intake doesn't match their requirements, we're going to see sows and gilts that are under their maintenance requirements during lactation just because their intake capacity can't match. And if they're too big coming in, they're more likely to fall into that category. So at the end of the day, we've selected for these girls to be leaner and less fat throughout the growing phase. We may have indirectly selected them to also consume less feed when they come into lactation, which can present some problems depending on what state they come into lactation. But in the reality of things here, we've got two data sets, again, gilts and sows, and you can see that we're talking about averages in a lot of these contexts, but each of these data points is actually showing you the feed intake per sow per day of lactation and the variation in one herd of gilts or one herd of sows. And so we all know from actual observations that individual sow intake can vary a ton. We've got some gilts in farms that eat half as much as their sow counterparts do, and we got to be able to account for that. But again, there is no average sow. We do know that on average, though, gilts are going to eat 15 to 20% less than sows, and especially in that population, we've got to do whatever we can to improve feed intake. So the question then comes, as we start to look at lactational feed efficiency, is there a way to improve the lactational efficiency in these gilt population, or do we need to alter their nutrition or management? You know, that can come in different forms, but first we need to understand what the variation in efficiency is. Secondly, we've got some sows, again, this was kind of the genesis of this research, we've got some sows that are gaining weight during lactation. Do we need them to always gain weight? If we know who they are, maybe those are girls that we could capture some savings on or feed them a cheaper diet, for example, if we have the ability to do so. So as we look towards defining lactational feed efficiency, first of all, in growing pigs, most of you are familiar with the calculation. We're talking about feed to gain, right? But in lactating sows, it's a little more complicated than that. But historically, the practical approach that people have used in farms, because it's what they had available, is how much does that sow eat over lactation versus how much did that litter weight gain if we had birth weight and had weaning weight. Those are things that are reasonably capturable, especially in research farms, right? Well, however, that tells us some basic efficiency things, but that doesn't tell us anything about sow tissue mobilization. And we're talking about that today, right? That back fat change, that loin depth change. These types of rudimentary measures do not account for sow body reserve changes at all. Just to illustrate that, I'll show you two sows here as an example. These are just examples of sows from our own data set. But if you look at sow 1 versus sow 2, I think if you look at the first few lines here, you can see that she ate less feed in lactation, but she had additional litter growth, so therefore better litter feed efficiency, and she weaned the same number of pigs. So in a practical, conventional concept, you'd say she's more efficient, right? But if we look deeper and we have more information, you can see that sow 1 actually lost more body weight during lactation. She lost more back fat and loin depth as compared to sow 2, who actually even gained some loin depth during lactation. And the costs of that may have really showed up in the subsequent cycle because that sow had an extra day in her wean to estrus interval. It took her that much more feed to recover that body condition she lost in the subsequent parity. And on the next litter, she had one less pig born. So this is a kind of a nice practical illustration of the fact that lactational efficiency is deeper than just feed intake divided by litter gain. Okay? So we've got to account for that catabolism. And so what we decided to do was run a trial, and we were grateful to have Brenneman Pork partner with us on this. And again, PIC and Gestall participated in this alongside the Brenneman Pork team. But this data was collected from a 10,000 sow farm in southeastern Iowa. farms equipped with precision feeding systems in both gestation and lactation. And we were fortunate that they've got a scale on site so we can weigh sows going into farrowing, coming out of farrowing. And we also had the privilege of having a scale, caliper, and an actual ultrasound on site so we could get all these measurements on these sows. In this study, we were able to capture data from just under 900 sows, PIC 1050 sows, and they were a fairly young herd, of an average of about an average parity 2, with a wean age of 20 days. A high percentage of these pigs were actually gilts, and so you'll see as we break up this data, we kind of separate it into a gilt population and a sow population. But you can see the pretty conventional measurements that we were able to capture to accompany our other data for lactational feed efficiency. You can see here that we recorded all the feed deliveries by day using the Gestall Quattro feeder that this farm's equipped with, and then their normal performance metrics were captured and incorporated in the data set. We measured litter weights at birth and then at weaning, and we cross-fostered these sows to a common litter size. So when we talk about lactational feed efficiency, we've got to think about the tissue mobilization here. And this is just kind of a hierarchy tree to show how we're encapsulating both the conventional measures of feed intake alongside if we know what her back fat and loin depth and body weight is coming in and going out, we can then calculate how much tissue she mobilized or didn't mobilize in order to account for that in regard to milk output and tissue mobilization. Ultimately, this can be shown as energy translated into piglet growth. So to quantify these energy pools, and I'm going to go a little bit fast on this for time purposes, we're basically trying to back calculate energy requirements based on litter size and litter weight gain. And you can see here that if we overlay this compared to some conventional metrics, because some of these calculations have been used in NRC 2012 as well as done by INRA in France. You can see that if we measure on the vertical axis the back fat change of sows in lactation against the estimated body lipid changes that we've typically used as calculations, the R-squared value for body fat change is actually pretty good, right? Historically, we've been able to capture back fat on these sows and measure that, and we can see that those estimated calculations are really good for back fat. However, when we think about the estimations for body protein change, historically we've rarely had loin depth to include in that. So we've typically done that using body weight change and back fat change in the past. And you can see when it comes to predicting body protein change over lactation, the R-squared value is really low. So basically, it kind of matches up with the fact that these sows have changed a lot in the last 15 years since these calculations were originally built. And we need to update these in order to better reflect the modern sow. When we think about this with regard to correlating back fat change and body weight change, a lot of sow trials that are done, although Omar alluded that they aren't done as often as we'd like, a lot of those sow trials have typically been able to get body weight change, right? If we can only get body weight change, then the question is can we estimate back fat change using body losses? You can see that both the back fat change prediction is an R-squared value of 0.14, pretty weak. And if we look at that with loin depth, it's even weaker yet at only 0.08. So what this tells us is, again, body weight change alone on these sows doesn't really accurately predict changes in fat or loin depth composition. So since we had that in this study, we were trying to figure out how to visualize this so that we could eventually present it to an audience, okay? What we decided to do was to actually categorize this. This is actually based off of some poultry research in laying hens. We kind of stole the idea, and it was a nice paper that I think helps really visualize what we're talking about here. But we decided to categorize the sows from this 900 sow study into 4 quadrants, okay? If a sow was above the mean energy output, which again was calculated off of litter weight gain, she fell into the blue side of the categories here, right? She had above average milk production within the population. The sows that were below that obviously fell into the red side on the left bar here of low milk production. The catabolism one's a little bit trickier here, but basically we measured whether the sows gained or lost back fat and body weight and muscle tissue to help decide which side they'd land on. If we had a sow that gained either back fat or loin depth during lactation, remember that was part of the reason we started this trial, they fell into the top side of this, right? Low catabolism. They weren't mobilizing as much tissue as others. Highly catabolic sows were losing both back fat and muscle depth. They fell into the bottom quadrant of that, okay? This seems a little complicated until I think we put names to it, all right? I thought this just kind of really helps you visualize it, right? So if we think about it in the context of the selfish sow, she's a sow that is gaining back fat or loin depth or both at the expense of her litter. Maybe it's because she was losing weight in late gestation and she's prioritizing her own body rebuild over the litter, but she's not milking very well and she's gaining weight. I'm a cattle guy on the side, and so I hope I don't pick on any Hereford breeders in the room, but I think about the Hereford cow. She survives, right? She always breeds back, but she doesn't always raise a really big calf because she doesn't milk that good, okay? If I go to the other side of the quadrant, we can talk about the martyr sow. I think this is the sow that most of us think conventionally is what a sow should do. She milks at the expense of her litter, sometimes to her own detriment, and doesn't breed back. And so I think of her maybe like a Holstein or something, that she's really milking well, but we got to make sure that we get enough groceries in her or she may not have fertility, right? The other two quadrants are the super sow and the inefficient sow. The super sow is pretty self-explanatory. She's gaining weight, gaining back fat, and still weaning a really big litter because she's milking a lot. Obviously, we'd like to have all of them be in that quadrant, but I think you can probably guess they don't all fall into that quadrant, right? The inefficient sow is one that is pretty concerning because she not only milks badly, but she's still catabolic and still losing a lot of body tissue. So guess what? She probably doesn't stay in the herd as long, right? Or we hope not. So once we've set up those definitions, you can see here that in this population, which is probably not reflective of all genotypes or all situations, you can see that 22% of gilts and 13% of gilts and 22% of sows fell into that selfish category. Gaining weight or gaining back fat, loin depth, not weaning off a great litter. Inefficient girls were a concerningly high percentage, right? 35% of the gilts in this population were below average on milk yield for just their parity. That was not compared between gilts and sows, and still highly catabolic, and 25% of sows. On the kind of the good side of the equation here, the martyr sows were the highest percentage of the population. I don't think that would surprise anyone, but I think we maybe would have thought that the percentages would be even higher for girls that fall into this category. And the super sows, super gilts, right? Not a huge population, but obviously I think this is one of the reasons why PIC helped me spend time on this, is I think these are girls that we'd like to understand what genetic traits they have that we could maybe select for or exploit to get more of these in every population, right? Because we got 17% of sows and 9% of gilts that are both gaining tissue throughout lactation and still weaning off a really nice litter. I think the only problem there is we wish those percentages were higher. So here's that all together, and I think this is probably like one of the main visuals for you to see, is just where sows fall in a pretty normal population with regard to lactational feed efficiency. The obvious follow-up questions to this is, what do we do about it, right? So from a genetics standpoint, I think we can ask the question, and there's several genetics people in the room, is can we select for or against some of these profiles if we know about it early enough in their life? Some of the questions I get asked is, if we know how efficient they are in the GDU, could we use that as a predictor for how well she does in lactation? Right now, the answer is I don't know, but I can tell you that's one of the next studies we're going to be working on, is trying to figure out if that's repeatable, if it's in parallel, right? But conversely, if we've got sows that maybe fall into the martyr category or the selfish category, I would argue maybe that falls more onto how you manage those girls, right? If I know that she's not going to use the feed that I put in front of her, maybe I don't need to give her as much, right? But I have to know that she's one of them first in order to do that. Or the martyr sow, for example, maybe we need to get her a more nutrient-dense diet so that she doesn't mobilize too much tissue and can still produce the milk yield that she did. So, some of these slides that come next are really just further validating what I just showed you. But basically, it's no surprise that a lot of sows lose body weight during lactation. Still, the vast majority of them do. But if I flip this chart, you can see that particularly in sows, a relatively high percentage of each category actually gain body weight during lactation. We're talking about empty body weight from when they farrow to wean, okay? 24% of gilts, especially those in the selfish category, even gained weight. And so I would argue that's not a very attractive trait in a gilt for her first litter. For back fat change, you can see that The martyr and inefficient sows and gilts lost more back fat. I don't think that should surprise you at all. They were highly catabolic. That's why they fell into that category. Same for loin depth change, right? This is just validating those different quadrants that these sows fell into. But what you can see when you overlay that in terms of litter feed efficiency and average feed intake, I use a couple of boxes. I don't have the boxes here, but what you can see is that in gilts, we have feed intake highest in the super gilts and lowest in the inefficient gilts. And that holds true for the most part on the super and martyr sows as well versus the inefficient sows. But when we overlay that with their teat count and their initial litter size and weaned litter size, what you can see is that if we have some way to select for or manage around those super or martyr gilts and sows, we're weaning almost a full pig more in the gilt and sow litters by focusing on those girls. If we can get a higher percentage of those girls, we're talking about more pigs weaned, and that's a combination of both pre-weaning survival in those sows, as well as the fact that they're producing more milk. So that leads us to look at feed intake. Okay, we started this by saying I get a lot of feed intake data on farms that have our feeders. So we did a study a few years earlier where we were able to illustrate the feed intake patterns of sows. There was some research done back in the 90s at the University of Minnesota that kind of defined these 6 feed intake patterns, and so we didn't reinvent the wheel, but we categorized sows from 15 different sow farms in 2022 into 6 different feed intake pattern categories. And you can see the percentage of sows that fell into those categories in the blue bubble over them. What you can see is the blue line on each of those color graphs is the actual sow intake relative to expectations. So you can see, for example, if I highlight the major category for you on the screen, you can see that she had a major crash at some point during lactation. She was on the right path and then she took a dive, right? So that was called major. Whereas, for example, the bottom two, low, high, high, and low, 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 those were girls that never really got started the right way in lactation. The low, high, high eventually gets going and starts eating, whereas a low, low, low just doesn't eat very much, right? From a percentage standpoint, it's a very low percentage, right? It should be, right? But if you take the 3 categories that were defined as truly detrimental to subsequent performance, low, 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 high, high, and major, and add them together, at least in these 15 sow farms, which were reasonably good producing farms from my own choice, that's 25% of the sows in those farms that we could potentially impact if we could find a way to react to those bad feed intake patterns. If we overlay that onto the feed efficiency categories that I spent most of the time talking about here, what you can see is that the low, high, high, low, 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 and major crash, not surprisingly, is in a higher percentage of the inefficient and selfish gilts and a higher percentage of the inefficient and selfish sows. So what this kind of all circles back to is I'm not expecting everybody to put in ultrasound in all their sow farms today, but it really kind of gets us back to feed intake and early lactation in particular. If we can impact those girls and maybe reduce the number of girls that fall into that major crash, low, 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 or low, high, high, and we can do something about that, we can probably impact their lactational efficiency even without maybe all the extra tools that you need to capture and truly illustrate that. So as we kind of draw this message to a close, I did want to say, one of the things that we've done as a follow-up to this, and I don't have the data here to present, but maybe it's something you can see us present in the future, is we also wanted to challenge these girls that are asking for such a high amount of feed and not doing anything with it. So we've actually completed 2 commercial studies where we, instead of giving sows ad libitum feed intake, we actually put a cap on their intake at their requirements. And we said, all right, well, let's stop giving her more than she needs in late lactation and see what happens. A little bit surprisingly, we've seen pretty good reductions in feed wastage, is what it really boils down to, with no impact on litter performance or rebreeding success. So that's kind of the real caveat here, is I don't necessarily want you to come away from this saying that Hyatt's telling you should limit feed intake in lactation. I don't think that would, probably do well going back to your home operations. But it does say that there are some sows in all these populations that are wasting feed, and if we had a way to manage it and know who they are, we could probably save quite a bit of feed. So ultimately, the point is we've got a really wide variation in feed intake, body loss, and milk output in the average sow farm today, and we needed to kind of redefine what lactational feed efficiency is in order to truly account for body tissue mobilization. And today's equations for body weight do not accurately represent body tissue mobilization. And so for future researchers, some of you guys in the room, I think you need to be able to account for back fat and lean tissue mobilization alongside body weight. Maybe at least in commercial research, can we use ultrasound at times it's harder sometimes to add a scale in a sow farm research study than it is to maybe bring in an ultrasound. So that's one of the questions I would ask is, could an ultrasound replace the scale to maybe allow us to do some larger commercial studies on sows? But in these populations, there really is only a minority of sows who are truly efficient. And hopefully we can select for those girls while maybe selecting against some of the ones that are really inefficient. But we've got a high percentage of these gilts that are most at risk. And I think as an industry, we've got a problem with young animals leaving the herd too early. And the more we know about what they're doing and what they're coming in like, maybe we can manage that to help reduce it. And some of these sows clearly have a better chance to produce well or at least avoid extreme body weight loss. But one of the things I didn't spend any time talking about was subsequent reproductive performance, just in lieu of time. What we did find in all of this is basically no matter what lactational feed efficiency category they fell into, it didn't impact their breeding success at all. These girls are remarkably resilient. They breed back. They don't really have a difference in wean to estrus interval or subsequent litter size. But it does impact the litter at hand, and we don't really have a good idea of how much it impacts their long-term survival and long-term cost. So I already talked a little bit about the potential feed savings that we could get if we have the right tools in the barn. It really adds up quite a bit, but until we know which sows those are, it's going to be a little hard to even do that. So hopefully I've given you guys some things to think about with regard to the fact that a lot of our gilts today are bred too heavy, and the cost of that in our farms today is adding up in terms of feed use. I hope you can appreciate that lactational feed efficiency is maybe more complex than we conventionally thought, and some of the old metrics were probably misleading people in the industry. And again, just bringing it back, there is no average sow. We've got a huge amount of variation in our sow populations, and maybe with the combination of technology and data, we heard a lot about AI tools, we can use genetic selection and maybe some precision feeding technologies to manage lactational feed efficiency in our populations going forward. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your time and remind you that this was definitely collected with a lot of help, both from PIC and a couple interns we had at Brenneman Pork. And I want to thank you guys for your time and attention.
We'll open the floor for a quick question if anyone's got one.
Oh, I can just yell. You don't need to walk over back here. Are you finding that these girls are staying in those categories over time compared to parity?
Yeah, like the repeatability of that. That was probably another really good question that we got as a follow-up. I think Omar said earlier how hard it is to capture all this data on commercial trials. Following these populations for another parity was kind of beyond the scope of what we could achieve. But I would wager that that is an important question for us to ask, right? And I would say that's part of the question too, is maybe there's a way we can predict this even earlier in life, because if we have some indication of these girls' long-term lifetime success, but we could see that in the GDU stage, we could probably use that as a factor on whether they make it into the breeding herd or not, right? But that repeatability is an important question that I challenge you to do that, I guess, because it takes a lot of logistics to put together a 900 sow study, let alone one that you follow for multiple parities.
Thanks for a great presentation. One question I had, you had a lot of information, but as far as those quartiles or groups that you ended up with, how much of that outcome was based on because you already talked about their body weight and age at breeding and gestational weight change. Could any of those outcomes in terms of their lactation category, how much of that is a result of what was happening during their breeding and then gestation body condition changes?
Yeah, I think a great question. So just to kind of restate John's point is, depending on what they were doing in gestation, how much impact did that have on what category they fell into in lactation? I hadn't seen Ron's data until we had already done this study, so we probably could have done it at that farm as weigh those girls in gestation, but I think it definitely impacted it. I think Ron's data clearly impacts that basically whether they're in a catabolic state or an anabolic state in gestation is going to impact what they do in lactation. So some of those inefficient girls or selfish girls, probably even more so, if they were deficient in gestation, they're probably likely to then compensate for that in lactation and keep that tissue for themselves rather than putting it on the pigs. So what it tells me is we need to understand that in gestation and make sure that we've got our diet formulation and our feed allowances right so that those girls are coming into lactation at the right state. I didn't spend a ton of time on it, but there was still also a pretty clear connection that the girls that were selfish and inefficient actually were fatter and had deeper loins coming into lactation, even though they were selfish and inefficient. The martyr and super sows were leaner and had shallower loin depth, but they still put out the most milk. So, the old data that basically says if she's fat coming into farrowing, we're going to have more problems with her basically. She's going to eat less, mobilize more tissue. That rang true with this as well. So I'm not sure how that fits with Ron's data about her losing weight during gestation because they kind of interfere with each other a little bit. But I think we need to tie all that together, right? We need to follow some girls from the GDU all the way through multiple parities, and I challenge you guys in the audience to put together the trial to do that because I haven't had the bandwidth yet to do that myself.
Let's thank our speaker.
Cut down. Thank you.